But when you time it very well and you properly design the structure and you don't make mistakes you have to rework, you do very well with the schedule. Almost where a typical or an experienced construction person would be skeptic at first to say you could save 30% on the schedule, they'd say, well, and I walk on the moon, but it is true. Especially if you have an experienced team that's built in that, used that process before and has good partners.
Hey, what's up, everyone? Welcome back to another Construction Curiosities live Q&A. This week I got Anthony Gude. He's the Director of Development at Leap of Faith Partners. They specialize in modular multifamily systems in Los Angeles. What's up, Anthony? How are you doing?
Hey, how are you? Good to be on with you, Matt.
Yeah, thanks for coming on and sharing all your wisdom with us. You want to give us tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Well, I'm in the modular industry for several years now. I've been focused on coming over to the ownership side. I've been with Leap of Faith Partners for some time as Director of Development now. Prior to that, I worked in structural systems design at RS Tavares, exclusively modular design program for structural engineering. And it's ultimately I now operate out of Los Angeles, and happy to share a bit about what it's like to acquire and deliver projects in a modular fashion.
That's cool, man. So when I was in college, we did a geology field trip to San Antonio. And anyway, ended up learning about the Hilton Palacio del Rio, the right. Hilton on the Riverwalk that was built in the 60s for the World's Fair. Anyway, I thought it was super cool. I got super interested in modular construction, but it's not real popular, in the States, I guess, like it is in the rest of the world. Can you explain, I guess, in layman's terms, like what is modular construction?
Sure. Well, it's an extension of prefabrication. So prefabrication is when you pre-build components off-site, typically more common in the trades, mechanical, electrical, plumbing. You don't get your power generator, as a stack of sort of cables and wires. But we extend that to the structure of individual, what they term modules that are 3D volumetric, pre-built structural elements with the mechanical, electrical, and plumbing already built in. And so you deliver those on site, presuming that your horizontal is done, and you assemble them, make the connections, of course, to your site utilities and module to module, and then you have a completed building. So that's the modular approach, volumetric modular construction approach.
So in multifamily, is it? So I know in some hotels and stuff I've seen, a lot of times there'll be like a main riser chase, and you basically set your building blocks and basically plug them in. Is it sort of the same?
Right. Well, we still have variety between building types. Like our Ventura project is a townhome and multi-dwelling individual buildings, and hotels lend themselves well to the process because you have your corridor and a lot of repeatability throughout the units. So there's a lot of consistency there. It's always design dependent, but the hotels lend themselves very well to prefabrication. The finishes are a bit challenging and sometimes require some passover, but for our multifamily product, it's very fitting. It's also larger scale projects, right? 150 or so units, 125 units in Ventura, but typically 150 plus. And you're talking about a large site development where you have room to position the modules, which is important. There's a lot to take into consideration, but overall, the product type varies with the approach. Yeah.
What's I guess on a 125 unit build, I guess what's a schedule like for? I guess I know it's probably a lot more upfront versus standard construction, but how does the schedule compare?
Sure. So schedule acceleration is something that the modular industry and prefabrication in general, for sure, both are tangible and are aggressively marketed as one of the benefits. The primary schedule acceleration and constraint sort of goes hand in hand is that you have to front load your design schedule ultimately to be able to build a building somewhere other than the site. So you don't get the same flexibility that you would typically have, not from the built element. You have the same level of flexibility. You can do anything anywhere if you put your mind to it. But you do have to design those elements early in the process because your building is coming to the site already completed. And so that's both the reason many groups market saving 30 to 50% of the schedule. I'd say we're in that realm, even more aggressively perhaps because we also in-house the site work. But when you time it very well and you properly design the structure and you don't make mistakes you have to rework, you do very well with the schedule. Almost where a typical or an experienced construction person would be skeptic at first to say you could save 30% on the schedule. They'd say, well, and I walk on the moon, but it is true. It's especially if you have an experienced team that's built in that, used that process before and has good partners.
I got you. You said a minute ago that, finishes could be a little tricky. Is that because it's hard to keep everything rigid? And so in transport and then setting them, they kind of mess up the finishes. You got to come back and touch up?
It's specific to hospitality because I understand that we haven't done any of these at Leap of Faith per se, but I've been looking at some hotel projects. And my understanding is that the specification, the conflict is that you're an owner developer and you're also cooperating with a brand, your Marriott, your Hyatt, and that their expectations on level of finish before it leaves the factory, they have to take into consideration the repairs you have to make once you get there. And yes, you have some tile cracking, you have to do some patchwork once it arrives on site, but nothing that affects the actual built product. But there could be, you have other stakeholders that are watching your process that are not aware of the steps necessarily. And I say brands generally, not the ones I just mentioned, because they're very pro modular and making a lot of advancements in that space. But more so, lesser brands that are less cognizant of the process. So in multifamily, we have our checklist. You have your QC at the factory. You have your QA at the factory, QC when it leaves the line. And then you have a site PM, a factory PM, and you catch all of those. Everyone's on the same page of where you need to be. Not any different than typical construction, just your touch points are a little bit different. Yeah.
I got you. That's pretty cool. What are some other pros and cons, I guess, for modular?
So, so extended coordination is that element that we just talked about front-loading design and getting ahead of those RFIs early because they cost more ultimately if you get to the site. The second, I think, would be from a business perspective. I think there's a general, there's the culture in construction. I think that your subcontractors ultimately, it's a top-led organizational process. And I think that there's an incredible benefit to having your fabricator as your partner in a lot of ways because they're doing a lot more. They're financially solvent. They're producing a lot for you, and they self-perform all the trades more than likely. If not, it's a repeat contractual relationship with the subcontractors versus a site, which might vary. Well, definitely does vary project by project, and even those relationships would likely be made on that project. So for that repeatability, I think that the trade-off is that the business relationship is a little bit more, it's less transactional, but in doing so, there's a little bit more reliance between the buyer and the seller. So when you discuss with a fabricator, you're relying that they're going to bring you this product. There might be less competitors in the market as suppliers of volumetric modular, so that might affect the business relationship. We look at it like a benefit. We get a stronger partner that's has more transparency in their process. They look at us. They have a quality design that was accelerated faster. These are all pluses and minuses, but of course, then you have two strong negotiating parties. I can go wherever I'd like to take my 200,000 square feet, and the fabricator, very well has, 5 or 10 other companies knocking on the door. So, when it comes to adoption, the growth has been exponential in the U.S. The total market share is still lower, and the consumer doesn't see it because it's much more challenging to have a fabricator scale scatter site with individual small clients. They're all looking for developers like us that are doing 100 plus unit projects. So there's a very big disconnect between what's actually happening, I suppose, in the modular industry and public perception.
Gotcha. Is it more popular?
There.
Oh, it's all good, man. I'm learning a ton. Is it more like regional? Like, is there more in California than, say, where I'm at in Texas or different parts of the country?
A lot of the great groups are out of Texas, actually.
Oh, really?
And I'm having a great time with them. Our architect is out of Austin. There's a lot of fabricators, not just multifamily, but I have some overdue visits with one group that makes modular, the superstructure and everything, but focused on power systems and data centers. They're out of Dallas, Fort Worth. You have a great import market there as well from south of the border. Coastal, I have some experience being from the East Coast and moving west for modular. And if I had to, this might have to take a moment to think about it, but there were more shops, it seemed, in the mid-range, like 10 to 50 million scale, a little less sophistication, but producing a lot of product out of the Northeast. And then when I came west, I found a lot more sophistication, but consolidated, like less groups getting more of the market share and more of the tech, and taking a totally different approach. I think one time it was described to me as the Northeast was more traditional in their approach, and the West Coast was higher growth. And I haven't necessarily done a full audit. I am a develop real estate sometimes, but that would seem to be a good way to refer to sort of the two coasts. And then the entire sort of Midwest is somewhere in between. There's highly sophisticated operations melded in with what's generally more available labor and tooling. So you see a lot more just action-oriented businesses. We much prefer, there's the factories that are advancing technologically, and those that are just traditionally proficient. And we always put traditionally proficient first, and then we'd like if you were well marketed and growing and fancy, but it's not a requirement. So those are the challenges you see on the West Coast versus the East. We're bringing modules all the way from the other side of the country.
Oh, wow.
Before, when I came into this industry, everyone told me it was the 200-mile limit. It wasn't financially feasible otherwise. I've seen what the projects I've worked on before got shipped from other countries. These are relatively small multifamily projects, like 20 homes coming from the East Coast to the West Coast. Again, depends on the price point, business relationship, and then if you're okay making a long route like that logistically.
I guess it's the cost of fuel too, whatever it's at that year.
Oh yeah, and it's hammering you, But I think there's different ownership group approaches. We intend on bringing logistics, at least the owning of the assets in-house. And there's just an appetite for risk that you have to evaluate. What we don't do is we don't fabricate. So we'll contract fabricators and have a dedicated PM for the project, work with each one. We found that to be the best model. So we'll cost cut on the commodity of, trucks rolling the wheels. But we won't say compromise on, trying to bring fabrication in-house and be completely vertically integrated, because ultimately we still have to do our road shows, finance acquisitions, acquire them, entitlements, and everything that happens before construction happens. Right. I don't know what people's perception of developers are, but there's a lot of work that gets done, years sometimes before we get to do the fun stuff and buy product and ship it to the site.
So the factories, are they is it like one factory, they self-perform all the trades, or do they have like subcontractors within the factory? Like they have an electrician that'll come in and a plumber that'll come in.
I've seen both.
Okay.
I think the larger the operation, the more likely they are subcontracting, but that might be very much that might be an assumption. But I see that the larger operations need to be able to call on more in a shorter notice, right? We start 2 buildings
Ramping
next
up.
month. We're probably not going to hire up 75 people.
Right.
And then smaller operations, I see it. They try to keep 15 to 35 people on regular payroll, and then kind of scale that up and down as buildings come on a single line operation. And this is again talking like I have never been the operating manager of a modular factory, but I do know a handful. And the general idea is that that's one of the larger challenges. So if they sub out, they're still subbing out at different rates, and I would imagine because you're not negotiating for the one project like you would on the one site, and the subcontractor's not projecting his costs based on driving to A, B, C site. They know that they're talking to a factory, that they have multiple buildings coming down that line in perpetuity. The factory is located in one place, and that subcontract is, I would imagine, negotiated with that intent.
Yeah. I imagine too, is for the subcontractor, they can almost predict their labor a little bit easier too, because it's a factory setting. It's not like you're on a job site, you're going to get rained out, or you're going to have delays on the job site and all those sort of things.
Yeah, that and the general idea that predictability of where the site is. It's always in the same place. And yeah, the weather advantage is always sort of touted. I tend to focus on risk control, the consolidated supply chain, sort of repeatability in the business model. Those are the things that we go to investors and say, like, we're better able to manage risk because we have less points of contact. If we have to unwind a project, we're going to find all the subcontractors in one place. We're going to have to go tracking them down. So that sense is how we've always focused on higher ROI and lower risk, and not just higher ROI on the schedule affecting your dollar performance on the project, but even again, back to, I guess, the business relationship and negotiating with a factory that ultimately would like to see and needs regular and consistent volume. We found that we've been able to negotiate multi-project volume much more effectively financially. And I think that's something that maybe is reserved for developers at scale. Probably be different if we had 125 scatter site homes across California, but more challenging, maybe less attractive to a fabricator. But no, that's been the approach and general value proposition.
Gotcha. What's some other misconceptions about modular?
I think people confuse people. I think the public in general, if they're not totally aware of how the process works, tend to confuse the product with the process. And I think there could be I think one person could take that as their brand and just run with it. Because, anytime you interact with GC, builder, subcontractor, you always have an understanding of the conversation of when you're hiring this person or group is that you're determining what they can build, what they have experience building, and what they're willing to deliver. It's no different with the factory and or with those in the supply chain of modular or industrialized construction. But for some reason, many have decided that, well, it's pre-built. I've seen something like this. This one home was called prefabricated one time, and it looked like this. Good or bad, that becomes that model. Whereas we never say, okay, well, I saw a site build home the other day. It's looking rough, right? But I don't now think that every site built home looks like that. And so that's the difference between that modular is not a product. Modular is ultimately it just means the putting together things. But it's not a product in itself. All factories produce different product. All businesses have different business models, different talent in their facility. They're all producing different things. You can pay $800 a foot for those that market sort of high-end ADUs, or you can pay $200 a foot at scale with a premium builder grade product. So I think that's probably the biggest misconception. And I guess it's not as sexy to call it a different process, but that's ultimately what it is. It's still construction. Everything still goes together how you would imagine.
You just, instead of shipping little blocks to put together in the field, you're shipping big blocks to put together in the field.
Yeah. It's honestly every year I just think about how much simpler it was, and I'm just pat myself on the back for making a career out of it. But it's really not that different. You just have to do. It's the approach in what you have to do differently, right? So when your design team has to do things differently than they're used to, then that's just what you have there. When your business relationships are a different dynamic, it seems like a small change, but it's massive for those that have done 10, 20, 50 projects a certain way.
Yeah. It feels, you said it's growing exponentially. It still feels like it hasn't caught. I mean, there's people all over Texas you just mentioned. I've never heard of them. Why do you think it hasn't caught on as much in the United States?
Well,
yet? I guess it is starting to.
I think, I don't, there's a lot of numbers that come out of a lot of places. There was and again, we're talking about modular, right? So I guess we're leaning towards 3D volumetric modules that are pre-built. The structure is three-dimensional, an X, a Y, and a Z axis for those listening. But obviously prefabrication is a much larger portion of the market. Nobody really puts a number to that. Effectively, a large majority of everything in construction is also prefabricated, anytime you have two or more components together. But volumetric modulars may be pinned at 200 billion total global market value, which is actually really small. And then I've seen numbers between 2 and 5% of the U.S. market. Now, we can definitely tap the folks at ModX who do a lot of research in that space. They'll definitely give you better reference points. But ultimately, that's not enough for every consumer to be any part familiar with it. If only 2% of people had iPhones, we probably wouldn't really even, we wouldn't know about it. It definitely would be like the black sheep of iPhones, if you only had 2% of people that had them. So there's that activity. When I refer to the exponential growth in commercials that the big hotel groups take it on, it's a no-brainer for, industrial real estate or data centers and that sort of development. And then multifamily, I think we're one of the pioneering groups in that space. But I've seen it. I've seen it as financially feasible. We'll have our 100-unit plus track record soon, and then I intend to push it super hard. So when I think maybe when those, and there's currently a sort of discussion about do you lead with modular or do you not? Because there's a bit of a momentum issue, right? Like I don't want to market something a certain way that might hurt my project, even though I'm passionate about it or I like it. And ultimately, it was only nobody really cares how things are built. I hate to say that, but I do. But like the many consumers are not necessarily, they'll just evaluate the product when they're there. And then if you tell them it came from the moon or not, they're more or less okay with it. But we were thinking of more than likely championing it as that type of project, if not consumer facing, definitely for the industry, because we're attracting more stakeholders in that space. But I think it's just seeing more of it, I suppose, and it's a momentum game. We're fully committed to it. We're about 10 projects in. This larger one at scale just sort of cemented that. And I think when I was at the structural firm, it was like 25% of developers would blow it, never come back. And then 75% or so would sort of latch on. And anytime all of their stakeholders recommitted, then they would do another one, right? The modular wasn't a problem. It wasn't necessarily an obstacle or an incredible benefit because maybe they didn't hit those timeline milestones because it was the first time or their second time. But ultimately, when you dial that in, that's a competitive advantage that might take you 10 years to get in a process you have to really build from scratch. But once you have it, my thesis and the thesis of Leap of Faith Partners is ultimately that there's no going back after you've sort of dialed that in. There's no other way to add on a serious amount of ROI without fundamentally changing some other lever other than the process. So
I got you. Well, I appreciate you coming on, Anthony. If anybody wants to learn more or get in touch with you, how can they do that?
Oh, well, I'm generally available, Now, LinkedIn's a great avenue there because it gives me a photo for everyone. And I can put them in the calendar. And yeah, I'm always open to talking about the industry, development in general. And they can, yeah, LinkedIn's a great channel. All you need is my first and my last name. I'll pop up there, and that'll be that.
All right, man. Well, I appreciate it. I'm learning a ton just in a couple conversations with you. So thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. Thank you for the time.
Thanks, man. Bye.